Welcome. Welcome to the deep dive. When you think about human history, it's not just a list of dates, is it?
Not at all.
It's this huge, sprawling, incredibly complex story. Millennia of it, billions of lives, amazing inventions, brutal wars, breakthroughs.
Yeah, it's absolutely massive.
Trying to get your head around it all can honestly feel like, I don't know, trying to drink from a fire hose.
It really can. The sheer amount of information we have now, archaeological digs, ancient texts being translated, it's almost too much sometimes.
And that's basically why we're here today. Our mission really is to cut through all that noise. We want to pull out the most important bits, the key insights, and give you a kind of shortcut to understanding these foundational human civilizations.
Think of it as a guided tour, maybe, hitting the highlights.
Exactly, a guided tour through some pivotal moments. We'll find some surprising facts, maybe have a little fun along the way.
Absolutely. We're going to journey from the very earliest human origins right up through some of those first big civilizations.
We'll look at different cultures, those major turning points.
And hopefully help make sense of it all. Not just what happened, but trying to understand, what does it all mean for us? For our shared story.
Okay, let's dive right in then, right at the beginning. Thinking about those earliest humans,
Yeah.
what was the one thing that really, truly set us apart? Put us on a different path from, everything else.
That's a great question. I mean, for tens of thousands of years, early humans were just roaming, living simple lives, but incredibly tough lives.
Right.
The real difference maker, even before writing pops up, was our knack for making tools. That's what defines the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age.
So hunter-gatherers, that's the picture. Right? What did a typical day even look like? I'm trying to imagine organizing dinner for 20 people with just like a pointy stick.
Yeah, pretty much. We're talking small nomadic groups, maybe 20, 30 people tops.
Okay.
The men generally handled the group hunts, spears, harpoons, that kind of thing, which actually probably built strong bonds, cooperation against danger.
Makes sense.
And the women, they were usually closer to camp, gathering nuts, berries, plants, and, crucially, taking care of the kids.
So different roles, but both vital for survival.
Exactly. Neither was seen as necessarily better. Survival needed both.
And then something huge happened. Fire. We just flick a lighter now, but back then, imagine the impact.
Oh, fire was utterly transformative. Huge. Suddenly you can cook food, makes it way easier to digest.
More than just taste, right? Health benefits.
Big time. Better nutrition, maybe even helped our brains develop over the long run. And it lit up caves, turned them from just shelters into safer, warmer homes.
And places for art eventually.
Right. It fundamentally reshaped how they lived, where they lived, how safe they felt. Everything.
Okay, so fast forward a bit. We get to maybe 10, 12,000 years ago. The last big ice age ends.
A major climate shift.
And this sparks maybe the biggest turning point ever, the agricultural revolution. Moving into the Neolithic, the new Stone Age, what was so revolutionary about swapping hunting for, farming?
It wasn't just about better tools. Those stone tools did get more polished, yeah.
Right.
The fundamental shift was moving from just gathering food to actively producing it. People started planting seeds, working the land, taming animals, sheep, pigs, cattle.
Giving them control over their food source like never before.
Exactly. Unprecedented control.
And that led to something massive. People stopped moving around all the time. They could stay put for generations.
That's the core of it. It allowed humans to become sedentary. And that's when you see the first Neolithic farming villages pop up.
What did they actually look like, these first towns?
Well, Jericho, near the Dead Sea, is one of the oldest we know of, built maybe 8,000 BCE or even earlier.
Wow.
And Catalhuyuk in Turkey, a bit later, but much bigger, 32 acres, maybe 6,000 people.
6,000 people. What were the houses like?
Mud brick, pretty cramped, actually. But the key thing, they had special areas just for storing food.
Storage. That leads to surpluses, right?
Precisely. The ability to store food consistently meant you had a surplus. And that changes everything.
Because if not everyone has to spend all day finding food, what happens? What new jobs appear?
Exactly. The surplus is what allows for a division of labor. Suddenly, people can specialize.
Like what?
You start seeing craftspeople making jewelry, weapons, pottery. Pottery becomes super important for cooking and storing all that grain.
Right.
You get specialized tools for farming, like obsidian blades, sickles. People start growing flax and cotton to make cloth.
And this must have had a huge impact on gender roles, too, often overlooked.
Right.
What changed for men and women then?
It was a massive shift, yeah. Men increasingly took over the primary food production, the farming, handling the domesticated animals, and often this meant their perceived value in society went up.
Okay.
Women were still doing vital stuff, grinding flour, making cheese, raising kids, obviously, but their work shifted more towards tasks doable near home. Spinning, weaving, sewing.
Tasks compatible with childcare.
Exactly, especially since breastfeeding often went on for 3, 4 years. Then around 4000 BCE, you get draft animals domesticated.
That oxen.
Right. And herding big animals. That really cemented food production as mainly men's work. It just wasn't compatible with raising very young children.
Mm.
So, yeah, the agricultural revolution deeply reshaped gender dynamics and social structures.
So humans settle down, build villages, have extra food. What's the next big step? It seems like the first proper civilizations really hug the major rivers. Why rivers? What was the magic ingredient there?
Rivers were absolute game changers, total lifelines. They provided the water needed for that large-scale agriculture, the kind that creates massive surpluses.
Surpluses needed for cities.
Exactly. Needed to support cities, social hierarchies, specialized jobs, complex trade networks. Rivers were like the ancient world's highways and power source rolled into one.
Okay, let's start with Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates. Around 3000 BCE, the Sumerians down in the south really harnessed those rivers, didn't they? What are they building?
They built some of the earliest proper cities we know of. Uruk, Eridu, Lagash. Impressive places.
Made of mud brick, right. Not much stone around there.
Yeah. Right, mud bricks and often big defensive walls, partly because materials like stone and wood were scarce, but also because there was conflict. And smack in the middle of these cities, towering ziggurats.
These huge temple complexes.
Yeah.
But they weren't just for worship, were they? The priests had real power.
Oh, absolutely. Priests were major players in governing. Kingship was also seen as divine, God-given. So the king handled the military, oversaw food production. But he worked closely with generals and those very powerful priests, a real mix of religious and worldly power.
Now, Sumer had fertile land, but you mentioned resources were scarce. Things like metal, timber. How did they manage that? It must have pushed them towards trade.
That's a fascinating point. It wasn't just about economics, it was survival. They had to trade.
Right.
Despite the rich soil, they lacked copper, tin needed for bronze and wood. Their innovation in trade, helped along by the wheel, which they used more and more.
Made them early globalizers.
In a way, yeah. They had to connect with other regions to get what they needed. They exported pottery, textiles, metal goods, and imported those raw materials. It shows how need really drives innovation, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And how did all this organization and trade shape their society? Was it equal?
Not at all. Sumerian society was very layered, very stratified, top tier, elites, king, priests, their families.
Okay.
Then you had dependent commoners working for the palace or temple. And free commoners, farmers, artisans, merchants, scribes, and right at the bottom, slaves.
Different kinds of slaves.
Yeah, chattel slaves, basically, property, and also people who became slaves temporarily due to debt.
Their cultural impact is still felt, though. That base 60 math system.
Yeah.
We still use it for time, angles.
Right, and the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's not just this amazing ancient story.
It tells us how they saw the world, their values.
Exactly, and their view of the afterlife, which was, frankly, pretty gloomy.
Interesting. Now, these early empires weren't always stable, were they? You mentioned Sargon of Akkad, briefly uniting Sumer.
Around 2340 BCE, yeah. Sargon created the Akkadian Empire, but it didn't last long. Attacked by mountain barbarians is the term often used.
So this cycle of uniting and falling apart.
It continued. You get more militaristic empires rising, like Assyria, known for being pretty ruthless, deporting whole populations.
Brutal.
But interestingly, the Assyrians were also collectors. They gathered texts like Gilgamesh in Ashurbanipal's royal library. So sometimes cultural preservation comes from unlikely places.
So Mesopotamia's volatile rivers shaped one kind of civilization. Let's switch gears. Ancient Egypt, the Nile. A completely different kind of river, right?
Yeah.
Predictable, calm. How did that shape Egypt?
The Nile truly was the gift, as Herodotus called it. Unlike Mesopotamia's often destructive floods, the Nile flooded gently, reliably, every year.
Leaving behind rich silt.
Incredibly rich silt, perfect for farming, and it didn't require the same kind of massive state-controlled irrigation works as in Mesopotamia. Less administration needed, smaller rural cities initially.
And Egypt was geographically protected too.
Very much so. Deserts to the east and west, the Mediterranean to the north, cataracts, rapids on the Nile to the south. All this fostered amazing stability for thousands of years.
And that stability allowed for unique developments, like Around 3100 BCE, King Narmer unites Upper and Lower Egypt, started the dynasties, the Old Kingdom, pyramid building.
Right. And the whole concept of the pharaoh, this divine ruler governing according to Ma'at, cosmic harmony, justice, truth.
What stands out about Egyptian society, especially compared to others back then? I'm thinking about women's roles.
Yeah, that's quite striking. Egyptian women, legally speaking, had quite a few rights.
Like what?
They could own property, they could take cases to court, make binding contracts, even serve as priestesses. And occasionally women became pharaohs. Hatshepsut is the famous example.
So more equality than elsewhere.
Relatively speaking, yes. Now, adultery was punished harshly, especially for women, but the legal system overall offered them a status quite different from, say, Mesopotamia or later Greece.
And another big contrast, their view of the afterlife.
Yeah.
Totally different from Mesopotamia's gloominess.
Oh, completely. Egyptians generally believed in a positive afterlife. It required complex rituals, preservation of the body, but the goal was to pass a final judgment.
The weighing of the heart ceremony.
Exactly. And if you passed, your soul, they had complex ideas about the Ka, Ba-Ak, could live on blissfully.
Yeah.
It was a hopeful outlook overall.
Okay, moving south from Egypt, we hit Nubia, modern Sudan, emerged around the same time, traded with Egypt. What happened to Nubia when Egypt's power faded?
Nubia's story is fascinating and often overlooked. As Egypt's new kingdom declined, Nubia actually grew stronger. They formed the Kingdom of Kush.
And even ruled Egypt for a while.
They did, for nearly a century until the Assyrians kicked them out. But then the Nubians discovered iron, shifted their capital south to Meroe, and really thrived through trade.
Building pyramids, too.
Loads of them, more pyramids than were ever built in Egypt, actually. A truly powerful African civilization in its own right.
Okay, let's shift our focus now, geographically and culturally, to the Aegean, the birthplace of what many consider Western civilization, ancient Greece. But before Plato and democracy, what was happening in the Bronze Age?
So, roughly 3000 to 1100 BCE, you had two main cultures. First, the Minoans on Crete, very advanced palace culture, distinctive art, their own script we call Linear A, still undeciphered, mostly.
Like a pen.
Then the Mycenaeans on mainland Greece, more militaristic, used a different script. Linear B, which we can read, it's an early form of Greek. These are the guys in Homer's Iliad. Think Agamemnon, Mycenae, that world.
So these advanced Bronze Age societies are flourishing, and then it all collapses. What happened, and how did Greece come back from that?
Yeah, around 1100 BCE, there's a major collapse across the eastern Mediterranean, the late Bronze Age collapse. Mycenaean centers were destroyed, populations dropped, writing seems to disappear for a bit. Greece enters what we call a dark age. Lasts about 3 centuries.
Dark because we don't have much information.
Partly, yeah. Fewer archaeological finds, no written records for a while. But eventually, things pick up again. Agriculture recovers, trade restarts. Crucially, they adopt the Phoenician alphabet, adapting it for Greek.
Which allows for writing again.
Exactly. And this is the period where Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, emerge. Foundational texts for Western literature, full of ideas about honor, excellence, the role of the gods.
And out of this rebirth, we get the polis, the city-state. Why was this such a core concept? How did it affect their military?
The polis was everything. It wasn't just a city. It was the community, the laws, the government, the identity, usually self-sufficient. Loyalty was primarily to your polis.
And militarily.
This shows up in the hoplite phalanx. Citizen soldiers, heavily armed, fighting shoulder to shoulder in a tight formation. It required incredible discipline and cooperation, a reflection of those polis values. Your duty as a citizen was tied directly to fighting for the city, though, of course, women were excluded from that citizenship role.
When we think of the polis, two jump out. Athens and Sparta. Such opposites. How did their values make them so different?
Polar opposites in many ways, yet both totally dedicated to their polis. Athens developed this radical, direct democracy, citizens debating in the assembly, serving on juries, getting paid for public service.
Why Sparta?
Sparta was this military machine. An oligarchy focused entirely on discipline, communal living from a young age, equality among the male citizens, all supported by the labor of the helots, a large population they'd essentially enslaved.
So different systems, but the city-state always came first.
Absolutely. The individual was subordinate to the state in both, just in very different ways. Interestingly, women's roles differed too. Athenian women were more restricted, often kept indoors. Spartan women had more freedom, physical training, a more public role.
These rival city-states sometimes united, though, like against Persia.
Right. The Persian Wars, kicked off by Persia's expansion under Cyrus the Great, were a huge unifying moment. Facing this massive external threat forged a sense of shared Greek identity. a pan-Hellenic feeling.
But that unity didn't last. They turned on each other in the Peloponnesian War. Athens versus Sparta. What was the fallout from that?
Devastating. It dragged on for nearly 30 years. Athens suffered a terrible plague, lost its great leader Pericles. In the end, it weakened all the major Greek city-states significantly, left them vulnerable.
Yet, paradoxically, this era of conflict also saw this incredible burst of philosophy. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, figures who still shape our thinking. What were they exploring?
It's amazing, isn't it? Socrates, always questioning assumptions, challenging authority, famously executed for impiety. His student, Plato, wrote these amazing dialogues exploring justice, ideal states, the nature of reality. And Plato's student, Aristotle, wow, logic, biology, physics, ethics, politics, often called the first true scientist. They were asking the biggest questions. What is justice? How should we live? What is the nature of the world?
Which brings us neatly to Alexander the Great, from Macedon north of Greece. His conquests were unbelievably fast and vast. Persia, Egypt, into India. What was his genius and his legacy?
Alexander was a military prodigy, no doubt. His tactics, like at the Battle of Gaugamela against a much larger Persian force, were brilliant. He clearly saw himself as a new Achilles, driven by this heroic ideal, supposedly slept with a copy of the Iliad.
Wow.
His legacy is complex, amazing conqueror, maybe less skilled as an administrator for the long term, but his death, young, led to the Hellenistic period. And that's where the really interesting cultural blending happens.
Right. His empire gets split up among his generals, creating these Hellenistic kingdoms, Ptolemaic Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in East, and Greek culture spreads like wildfire.
Exactly. Greek language, art, philosophy, administration spread eastward. You get Greek intellectuals, artists, administrators moving into these new kingdoms, interacting with local traditions. It's a massive cultural fusion.
And new centers of learning emerge, like Alexandria in Egypt. What kind of scientific leaps were made there?
Alexandria was incredible. A real hub of science and scholarship. You had Aristarchus proposing a heliocentric model, the Earth going around the sun, centuries before Copernicus.
Nice.
Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy within about 200 miles. We call him the father of geography. Euclid wrote his Elements, the foundation of geometry. Archimedes, another giant of science, though based in Syracuse.
And it wasn't just Greek science, was it? Didn't they translate other works?
Yeah, this is fascinating. The Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, was translated into Greek in Alexandria, a Septuagint. It really shows how pervasive Hellenistic culture became, influencing even deeply rooted traditions like Judaism.
Okay, let's pivot again to Rome. Founded, legend says, by Romulus in 753 BCE. Early kings, Etruscan influence. But then they ditched the monarchy in 509 BCE, established the Republic. How did they set up this new government to avoid having another king?
The Republic was cleverly designed, really. Lots of checks and balances. You had 2 consuls elected annually who led the army and government. Praetors acted as judges. Then the Senate, initially about 300 elder statesmen, mostly aristocrats, held huge advisory power, especially in the mid-Republic. And various assemblies gave citizens different levels of say.
Like the Centuriate Assembly.
Right, organized by military units. And the tribal assembly, a bit more democratic for other matters.
But it wasn't a perfectly harmonious system from the start, was it? This conflict of the orders, a long struggle.
Absolutely. A defining feature of the early republic. It was the struggle between the patricians, the old, wealthy, landowning aristocracy, and the plebeians, the much larger group of ordinary citizens, farmers, artisans.
And how did the plebeians gain ground? They were less powerful individually.
They used collective action. Their ultimate weapon was secession, literally walking out of the city en masse, refusing to work or fight. It paralyzed Rome. This forced the patricians again and again to grant concessions, written laws, access to offices, eventually political equality.
But later in the Republic, things got unstable again. Military reforms changed things.
Yeah, the Marian reforms in the late 2nd century BCE were crucial. They professionalized the army, but also made soldiers more loyal to their individual general, who promised them land and spoils, rather than to the state itself.
Which leads to powerful generals vying for control.
Exactly. Figures like Sulla, who was the first to take real advantage, marched his army on Rome, declared himself dictator, used prescriptions, basically hit lists against his enemies. It destabilized everything.
So this instability paves the way for figures like Julius Caesar and attempts to share power, like the triumvirates.
Precisely. The first triumvirate, Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar, was an informal pact to dominate the state. Caesar's rise was spectacular. He conquered Gaul, pushed through popular reforms, roads, aqueducts, citizenship, the
The
calendar.
Julian calendar, right?
That's the one. But his power and ambition scared the traditionalists in the Senate, leading to his assassination in 44 BCE, which of course just triggered more civil war.
And out of that chaos emerges Octavian. He defeats Mark Antony and Cleopatra.
And becomes Augustus in 27 BCE, the first Roman emperor. This marks the end of the Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire and the start of the Pax Romana.
The Roman peace. What did that actually mean for people living across this vast territory?
For roughly 2 centuries, it meant relative stability, peace within the borders, and prosperity. The empire reached its peak size, maybe 60, 75 million people.
Wow.
Greco-Roman culture, law, language spread throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. Roads, aqueducts, trade flourished. It was a period of remarkable cohesion despite the huge diversity.
But even mighty Rome faced crises. That 3rd century crisis sounds pretty bad. What was going on?
It was about 50 years, 235, 284 CE, of almost constant turmoil, military coups, assassinations, rapid turnover of emperors, often generals proclaimed by their troops far from Rome, add in economic problems, plague, barbarian invasions. The empire nearly broke apart.
How did they pull it back together?
Emperor Diocletian was key. He realized the empire was too big and complex to rule alone, so he split it administratively into 4 regions, the Tetrarchy, 2 senior emperors, Augusti, and 2 junior ones, Caesars. It was an attempt to restore order and manage succession while still emphasizing unity.
And around this time, another huge shift. Christianity goes from persecuted sect to dominant religion. Constantine's conversion.
A pivotal moment. Constantine converts around 312 CE. The story involves a vision before a battle. In 313 CE, his Edict of Milan grants Christianity legal tolerance throughout the empire.
And then Emperor Theodosius makes it the official state religion.
In 380 CE, yes, it's a massive turnaround. The religion Rome once tried to stamp out becomes the official faith. Quite ironic, really, as the church itself later starts suppressing the old pagan traditions.
Eventually, the empire divides formally, east and west, in 395 CE, and the western part gradually declines, what finally led to the fall of Rome in the west.
It wasn't one single event, more a long process, but key factors were increasing pressure from migrating Germanic peoples, Goths, Vandals, Franks, partly pushed by the Huns arriving from Central Asia.
These groups started moving into Roman territory.
Yes, sometimes invited as allies, sometimes invading. Rome itself was sacked by the Visigoths in 410 CE, then the Vandals in 455 CE. The Western administration weakened, provinces broke away. Until finally, in 476 CE, the last Western Roman emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic general Odoacer. End of an era, in the West at least.
So we've covered this incredible sweep, from tiny nomadic bands to the vast Roman Empire. Looking back across these foundational civilizations, what common threads do you see running through them all?
It's striking, isn't it? If you step back, you see this constant process. History feels like this, incomplete book that's always being updated with new finds, new ways of seeing things.
Right.
But some things feel constant. The human drive to organize society, whether it's a small band or a huge empire, the need for shared beliefs, whether it's spirits, gods, or philosophies, the relentless push for innovation, driven by need or curiosity, and fundamentally the drive for safety and survival.
From the first tools to Roman law, each step kind of built on the last, often shaped by geography or conflict, shaping who we are now.
Exactly. We've only really scratched the surface here today, but even in these early chapters, you see that mix of innovation, conflict, adaptation, the human story playing out again and again.
Which makes you wonder, despite all these massive changes, empires rising and falling, technology evolving, ideas shifting, those fundamental human drivers seem pretty constant, don't they? Organization, belief, survival.
They really do seem to endure across millennia.
So thinking about that constant drive, what does the next chapter hold for us? For this restless, creative, sometimes destructive species on this planet, what transformations are waiting around the corner? Something for you to think about until our next deep dive.